I have something I'm really embarrassed about. I didn't make my journal article,
Oh, that's okay.
and I still. Okay, sorry.
No, you're
I
good.
usually have one like it, but I.
You're good. Not a problem.
Thank you.
There's a lot of other things going on.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
awesome, no problem.
I'll be listening in upstairs, so.
Oh, listen, yeah, nice. What's that?
My name shouting for help already.
You got it. Hey guys. What do you say? Should we go ahead and get started? Okay, I need to just do a perusal here. I just want to look at groupings. All right, I'm seeing quite a lot of SOM over here, a lot of PT here, a lot of SOM. You got 2 PAs? Okay. OT? Okay. Let's see. No, we're good here. PT, PT, CLS.
I'm
all right.
PA, but I don't have a whole thing.
You don't have a thing. Okay, well that's all right. PA,
We're all PAs.
all PAs?
Yeah.
Who can we forcefully extract?
Mix and match over here.
Yeah. Can we do a mixing? A mixing matching here? Whoever wants to do it. So, welcome guys. Well, I feel like it's been a long time since we did the orientation session. Am I wrong? It's been like a month, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first session is a lot of fun because we focus. This is kind of the first of a few really, like, I would call them like big ideas in global health, and this one's on international development. And we're going to really spend a lot of time unpacking this idea because what I want to convince you by the end of this is that actually this field of global health that you guys are all keen and interested in is actually an offshoot of something that is even bigger, which is international development. Before we even get into that, we're going to do some good touchy-feely stuff since it's the first session. So I want you, there should be note cards on your table. You guys all have note cards? Anybody not have note cards? So take just about 5 minutes and write 3 reasons that you're interested in global health. Ostensibly, you took this course not for the prestige and not for the honor, but really for the fact that it's going to teach you something about global health. But I want to know why you're interested in it. Take about 5 minutes. 2 minutes. Nope, no names. Thank you. Cheers.
I'm sorry, Natalie. Like, I think I left my thing over there. I'm Natalie. I think I'm Ricky. Nice. And Desiree.
Thank you. Almost there? Okay. Almost there. This is one more. Okay. You got it? Thank you. Okay. Man, it's a big group. All right. So we are going to do introductions. I heard some of you anticipating that, so we're going to do some introductions. I'll tell you how we're going to do that. We'll go over some ground rules. I want to unpack this concept of health, right? So you guys are in the global health program. You're in a global health course, and we want to speak a little bit about what health means, because that actually has some different understandings outside of what we would consider sort of our biomedical paradigm. A lot of what we're going to be doing is in the next several sessions. Oh, excuse you. There's a lot that is related to history in global health and international development. And so we are going to spend a little bit of time kind of putting the context of this whole enterprise. We'll talk about the concept of development, and really this all is going to relate to the roles and relationships of major entities influencing global health and international development. I explained to you guys the intro session that we didn't make this stuff up. This is all related to consensus competencies. So here's what we're going to do, because it's the first session. You guys are going to be in these groups for the next several months. I want you guys to take a few minutes, introduce yourself to the group, your name, your program, your school, and then someone's going to be the reporter. Someone's going to be the one who's going to teach the class your names and your schools. Now, in your groups, you're going to talk about something. You're going to say something either interesting, funny, embarrassing, and what's going to happen is that the reporter is going to introduce everybody, and then he or she is going to stand up and say, one of us is this, or one of us has done this, and then we all have to guess who that is. Okay? All right. And it should be the maybe not the best, but certainly the most stunning, perhaps. Right? That makes sense? All right. Good. Go to it. 5 minutes or so.
A couple years ago. I was like, either before or after. I'm not getting married. Spending, arguing. Yeah, really. What's he doing? He's just surfing and fishing. Yeah, it can't work out. Like, we're sorry to work out.
You really set the bar, man.
Oh my gosh, so you love it. It sounds like it's going to go you want to circulate.
Embarrassing. You drive through it? Yeah, but we're. But I don't know. My rivalry. Yeah. So they're in Louisiana. Yeah, my dad. But he does. Okay. My brother played for hiding. My brother played for hiding. So I
used to work for a magazine.
It was like a little rival.
It's like this kid opinion magazine. There's like this graphic.
Yeah. But I have a. You're an art. She's an art student. Yeah. We're EA. Yeah, so that's all. We didn't laugh for like 2 minutes. Just go help
Two minutes, guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Are you like senior or
Yeah, but you know, like,
I know someone that's Sarah. Where were you at?
yeah, stay at back.
It was hot. I thought about that.
What?
Yeah.
Health professionals over here. I think here is a medical, but there. That might be. Yes.
All right, guys, are we ready? Yeah. Okay. So let's. By the way, Dr. Enderly joined us from CLS. You'll be seeing a lot of her next month. She's going to be leading our session on international aid. Let's start way up there. Who's the reporter? Introduce everybody to us, and then you got to stand up, make yourself loud and proud.
This is Judy. She's in the School of Medicine. This is Chelsea. She's also in the School of Medicine. This is Maria. She's also in the School of Medicine. And I'm Natalia. I'm also in the School of Medicine.
Oh, I didn't do enough I didn't do enough communication. We'll fix that later. Okay.
Okay, and the interesting story. So this person once went dancing with your girlfriend, and during the night, people came up to her, asked her to dance. She said no politely, her and her friends. And so this one person comes up to her, taps her on the shoulder, says, "Hey, do you want to?" Or no, she thinks that they're going to say, "Hey, do you want to dance with me?" So she immediately says, "Sorry, I don't want to dance." But they came up to her and tell her that her pants ripped.
Oh boy. So who is it, guys? No, we have to guess. It was you? Oh, all right. That is embarrassing. I would say that met the criteria. All right, let's move to you guys.
Somebody met their spouse on
Okay. Craigslist spouse. Who is it, guys?
Shut up. He's not my spouse. My significant other. Yeah, it's.
That's awesome. Was it like buying something?
No, it's personal.
Was it personal?
Yep, I'm that person.
Very, very brave.
I had a couple of glasses of wine. It was like.
That's awesome.
Hey, we were together for like 2 years. He's not a psycho. Not you.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I lucked out.
That is really good.
Like I'm blushing really.
No, you're doing great. All right, guys. Who's the reporter?
I'm the reporter. So my name is Jumpin from the School of Medicine. This is Camry from the OT School. Patrice also OT. Hugo PT, and then Gustavo is from the School of Medicine. So the embarrassing story from our group: one of us was studying really hard on a Friday night in the library and didn't realize the library had closed and was stuck in the library late at night on a Friday and had to call the police to help us get out.
Hugo?
No. No. It wasn't me. It was actually a Camry.
Wow. Or you could have just stayed the night. That'd be fun. People have definitely slept on those couches. They still have the couches?
Yeah.
Yeah? Sort of like all the saliva stains. All right, let's go here.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm the reporter for this group here. This is Flaw. He's a CLS. This is Morgan. Yes. She's in PA. Hunter, also PA. Desiree, PT. And then Elizabeth, also in PA school. And then kind of going along with the significant other spouse thing. one of us just recently got married to someone from England.
Who is it? What do you guys think?
Morgan? Yeah, that was me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Very nice.
Yeah, that's my husband's still dealing with immigration. We met in Bali, like Indonesia, a couple years ago. I was studying in Australia. We were just surfing. And it's global health.
There you go. That's right. I didn't see surfing on any of these cards.
Okay, cool. Okay, so my name's Maggie. I'm in PT schools. This is Doretta. She's in PA. John, PC. Natalie, PDK. Okay, so one of us went to Thailand, and there was a restroom there, and they kept going to the restroom there, and like they didn't realize that this restroom was the opposite sex restroom, but in Thailand they have the same facing, so nobody would tell them that they were going to the wrong restroom the whole time. So they found out at like the end of the trip. So who do you think it is? Natalie. Is it Natalie? No. John. Yeah.
Were they were they actual bowls or were they squats?
It was a porcelain crack in the ground, yeah.
I'm sure they thanked you for peeing in those things. From a tall distance. I'm sure it was very clean. Okay, awesome. Good. Well, we learned things about each other. So I'm not going to belabor ground rules. I think we've all been here long enough and we've done enough small group learning to know that that the ground rules are the ground rules. We want, this is all about respect. So don't interrupt people. Let others finish speaking. Go ahead and speak your own mind, but respectfully. These are going to be some heated topics sometimes. You know, development and global health are kind of softballs, but we're going to get into human rights, and human rights is a very passion. It stimulates a lot of passion. We're going to be getting into other issues in ethics and volunteerism. They can make us angry and frustrated, and we just need to be able to speak our own minds. Participate in the discussions, please. I don't want to go all Socratic on you. I don't want to have to be calling you out, but I will if I think you're being too quiet. Be open to new ideas. Really, only way we make the world better is if we start listening to each other and understanding both sides of things. And so we do our best in this class to really present issues and facts and information as they are perceived and as they are discussed at international level. And so we want you to do the same thing. So please just be open. If something I say seems controversial to you, I want to hear your thoughts on it and why you think it's controversial and why you disagree. And we are all open to those. I learn a lot of new things and a lot of new perspectives from you guys when we do this course. And of course, I want you to ask questions because there's really, especially in global health, the world is complicated. And so we want you to feel comfortable asking questions. May not always know the answer, but we will always toss it back to you. So this is a guy you are going to become very, very familiar with over the next 7 months. This is Fernando. So Fernando is a baby boy. He was just born to two very proud parents in the fictional country of GHICC, located in South America. Parents are so happy, and they're sitting there, they're watching him soil himself in his diaper and all those things that babies do, and they're just excited to begin their new life with him. And they just sort of start thinking about, what's their son's future going to look like? And how can they make that future as bright as possible for him? They will, any of you guys parents, like, we want the best for your kids, all right? You want the best for your kids. And so they're doing the same thing anybody else would do, looking at this kid and saying, how do I make this kid's life as bright as it possibly can? So I want you to take like 3 minutes in your groups, and you just write down as many things as you think. No, there's no budget here, all right? So tell me all the things that you think that Fernando needs to realize his potential, his full potential. both at the individual level, community level, national level, international level, social, economic. Just go ahead and just be very broad, all right?
Do it as a group.
As a group.
So one person right now.
Yeah. Yeah. One person will write, and I'm going to ask you for 3 of them.
How about just like clean water, access to yeah, healthcare. So
yeah, that's really the one day.
They have that it's also what mostly share.
Yeah, that's
And I appreciate it. Did you have to do anything with your son? Yeah, that's maybe healthcare, like other kids.
All right, guys, 1 minute and a half-ish.
Oh, I forgot. They give you sorry, so you know how we're on this party. One thing leads to another, you just like everything's
I think it's important to realize that. I'm not super good with
Yeah, my husband like he grew up as sodium.
Yeah.
yeah, they're just like that really close family friend, you know, that's like
All right, guys, what do you say? Let's go ahead and come together, and let's do reverse order, starting with you guys. So 3 things. I may actually so many groups. 2 things. 2 things. Yep.
Government stability.
Okay, governmental stability. Good. Why is that important?
If you're in the middle of an armed conflict or something, just genocide of people being dislocated.
Uh-huh. I like that. So I'm going to say even like peace. Good. And what else?
Clean air.
Clean air. So let's put that as sort of environmental protections, right? Those are literally, usually, the last things that come up when I ask that question in this class. So thank you for saying them. Usually I have to say, I have my class, my typical line, which is, I know it's really hard to teach this in Texas, but these things are necessary, right? At global level, these are conversations that people have. So, good stuff. What you guys?
So we were not that broad.
That's okay.
Education.
Good. That's broad. Absolutely. Education.
And socialization.
What does that mean?
Interactions with people that are not with you.
Okay.
We also
Let's put that as a supportive community environment.
Yeah.
Okay. So, supportive community environment. Yeah. So that's good, right? Because you can have a lot of socialization, but if it's with soldiers and you are a child soldier, then that's not exactly the best socialization. You're not going to want to send them to child soldier school. Right? And education, what education? What do you mean by education?
I feel like that would be open to
All right.
interpretation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we need a system of education, right? That is accessible, right? So let's say it's accessible,
And adequate.
adequate, affordable, right? Affordable would be nice. Good. Okay. And primary education, secondary education, tertiary education, quaternary education? The whole gamut, right? We would like
Sure.
all possibilities. What's the most
Whatever works.
what's the most important one? Primary education is actually
The
extremely,
foundation.
and yeah, and early childhood. So early childhood education is extremely important. What about you guys? 2.
We said one of them for healthcare, so having access to doctor visits and just like vaccinations and needs.
Okay, so you've said 2 kinds of healthcare there. No, that's not an oops. That's a good oops. That's like the best oops you can have. What are some broad? How can we paint with big strokes on those 2 things? You said 2 things. You said access to a doctor, and you said vaccinations.
So preventative care as well as acute care.
Yeah. So let's say you say preventive or curative, right? So I always get on people because we always hear preventative, but we don't preventate anything, right? So it's preventive and curative, right? That's not on you. They're probably literally there's 50% of people who would teach it the other way. I'm like, Dasho is totally wrong on that. You preventate things. So preventive and curative, yeah. And preventive is sort of, we kind of lump that under primary health care, right? Okay, so this is health care. And this is like services, right? So what else do we need?
So we need like self-identity, custom situations.
All right, self-identity. Can I blow that up a little bit? And instead of saying self-identity, call it self-efficacy. So self-efficacy, yeah, it's a fancy word, right? So self-efficacy is this idea that you are of value in the world, right? It's that because you have intrinsic value because you're a human being and you're on the planet, you deserve to be alive and to have certain rights, and that's self-efficacy. You get that from this supportive community environment in the setting of a good education where you're not sick, right? So self-efficacy is sort of the internal part of that. What else?
Well, I was going to say value, but food.
Yeah, food. Food is really important. Anybody hungry? Yeah. So what we typically goes with food and water. These are your Maslow's stuff, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs: food, water, shelter. Right? We'll put that together. We'll lump that as like a Maslow thing, right? So the food. What kind of food? Like we can just eat potatoes all day. So it should be a balanced. You should have access to a balanced food, right? It should be a balanced diet. What's that? Food security. What's that mean?
The access to all sorts of different nourishing foods, like a complete diet, and then the ability to have that.
Yeah. Do we have problems with food security here? Yeah. We have super problems with food security here, right? Because there's the sort of the so-called food desert, right? But There's food security problems even here at home. What about water? Any water's okay? Should be clean, right? How do we keep it clean? Huh?
Sanitation.
We don't poop in it, right? That's the way that's the way you keep it clean. So with water comes sanitation. Poor guy's in the corner. I'm taking away all your fun. Don't worry, there's plenty more that he needs. So sanitation. There's this magical thing that happens every Tuesday morning, right? I take some really terrible things from my house, like rinds of different food and meat products and whatever else, like my kids have produced, and it's in a bag, and I put it in this box in front of my house with wheels. And at 6:30 in the morning, this big truck comes around with flashing lights. It loads up my refuse and puts it in the back of this truck, and I never see it again. It's magical. Like, it's truly magical. And that helps me stay healthy, right? That helps keep me healthy because my water then is not percolating with all this other effluence that's around, right? So it's nice. Good. And then shelter, it should be adequate shelter. It shouldn't be, it should be stable. It should not blow over at the first sign of a hurricane, right? It should be good. And we need certain things to be able to make sure that people don't sell me a crappy house, right? So that kind of feeds back into this guy where they put all these regulations on what you can do with the food, the water, and the shelter, right? So, good. What else? Last group. You got the toughest job, but there's so much.
We literally had all of that.
Uh-huh.
So I'm not too sure what safety and
Good. So that's a big one, safety. So we talk about government stability and peace, but in order to do that, how do we stay safe? How'd you guys get here? Who drove? Yeah? And when you drove, in general, did people stop at the stoplights? And they stopped at the stop signs? Kind of. They did the Texas rolling stop. But generally, people obeyed the rules, right? Why is that? It's the rule of law, right? So, rule of law is very, very, very important. And so what do you need for the rule of law?
Peace officers.
Peace officers, and they shouldn't be corrupt, right? I mean, I've traveled a lot of places. I have paid a lot of bribes, right? And I'm not proud of that, but I'm also a gringo, and so I'm also very scared of Latin American prisons. So if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. So rule of law is really, really important. And we need a rule. We need that requires institutions like a justice system and a criminal justice system, and it requires even branches of the military to make sure that my country's interests are protected both at home and abroad, right? There's one big thing that isn't here that always, it's interesting. It's some groups, that's like the first thing. Some groups, it's the last thing. Money! Man, we need money. Who's going to pay for all this stuff? Right? We need money. And how do you get money? Work. And how do you get work? There's an economy, right? So it's actually sort of the world of development is in fact driven. But let's say the literature around international development is driven by economists. So of course they love having a job and they need their PhDs paid for. And so they say, in fact, you need economists, right? So, but you need an economy. The economy is really important. Without an economy, you really have none of this. You really don't have any way to support this. And we see this worldwide, right? In places where resources are more limited and where economies are less robust, that's where we see the poverty and we see lack of education. We see all of these things super low, right? Good job, guys. So I'm going to turn it back on you again. What is health? You don't have to sit in your groups. This one just spitball. What is health? If I were to say, define health for me, how would you define it?
Like a complete physical, mental, emotional well-being.
Whoa! Did you read ahead? What is health? Okay. The WHO defines health as a state of, and I'm going to read this a couple times because I think there's some important things. A state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity, right? So it's not just that like you had the flu and now you don't have the flu and now you're healthy. What sticks out here for you? So who's healthy here by this definition? Anybody healthy? Complete. No stress. No sleep problems. No social isolation. Sitting there sleeping in the library. So, I know a lot of students recently had a test, right? So it's like probably not so healthy leading up to it, but then you felt pretty good afterwards. And then you go out to the pub and you do things that also cause physical well-being problems, hepatitis and stuff, and so there you are the next day not healthy again, right? So the point here is that this, much like other things that we're going to talk about, are aspirational, right? These are ideas that are aspirational. So this is like if you did calculus, like the limit as it approaches zero, right? You're never quite going to get there, but you strive for it, right? So systems are going to be set up to try to help keep you and your society healthy and to try to achieve this goal, but really takes a village, right? And more than a village, it takes a system. So people actually do define global health. I mean, these concepts are not new, but it's really in the last 30 years is really when they've started to be sort of synthesized together. So global health has kind of 3 tiers when you look at definitions of global health. They talk about the individual level, so there's the individual determinants of disease and illness, right? That's sort of your biomedical approach. That's where that is absence of disease or infirmity, right? But then there's individual level risk factors, certain genetic predispositions. But then we move up to population level, and we're looking at social and economic determinants. We're looking upstream at what are the root causes of what's making people sick. And then we're going even higher in global health, and we're looking at multidisciplinary root causes. So not just in health areas, but also in social areas, cultural areas. What are economic determinants? What are some of the scientific areas that contribute to ill health, right? So it's multidisciplinary. The whole idea is that this is at the highest level, even in the the international political sphere, that inequalities in trade can affect health, right? That's how meta we're getting with global health these days, right? And generally, people will say that in global health, you're taking a political economy approach. And that means that you're not just looking at health in its own right, you're looking at health in a political, social, cultural, and economic context, and more importantly, how those structures like power, class, and gender influence disease, right? So that's the political economy of health, which is really what global health teaches. Does that all make sense? So there's a lot of buzzwords, all right, but yeah, I think you have an idea here that global health is more than just the human being and the disease the human being has. It's all of those meta things that are affecting health and the political economy, which is the power structures, the politics of health, right? So, what about development? You guys have heard developing country, a less developed country. You've heard of those terms, right? So what does it mean?
Think about like the spread of resources to people, and a lot of times when you have less development, those resources are all concentrated among a few people.
Okay, so once you get resources like equal between people, then you're developed.
Well, moving toward development.
Moving towards it, good. What else? It's kind of all of these things, right? It's resources, it's health, it's education, and is anyone in the world, is any society in the world truly developed?
You think they are?
Yeah, we think we are. We think we live in a developed country, right? But I mean, it doesn't take much to look down the road and say that, well, maybe we're not so developed if we have people living in developing world circumstances in our developed country, right? So then it speaks to the term, which is that this is probably not the best word, right? And in fact, in the world of global health and international development, even though people have already branded their programs development studies and stuff, so they can't get away from it, now they're very critical of that term. So what are some other ways you can kind of classify countries or communities, or some other ways that we can look at these problems of infrastructure, inequality, of poverty?
Income level.
Good, yeah, so income level, like World Bank loves using income level. Low income countries, low middle income countries, high middle income countries, high income countries. And that's actually nice because it's measurable. And generally those classifications go with what we typically think of as the amalgam or smorgasbord that is development, right? You can also say high resource, low resource settings. You know, there's a lot of ways to describe it, but when you say developing, it's kind of like it has a little bit of a sour taste, sort of like when we used to say third world. Does anybody know where that came from?
First, third world.
Yeah,
The Cold War, right?
Yeah.
Like countries that either weren't part of like the United States and its allies were first world, and then Russia and its allies were second world, and all the other countries.
exactly. So it was exactly, these were Cold War terminologies, and we just don't even use third world anymore. We don't talk about the third world because really it's just not granular enough, and it has a lot of political connotations. So there are a lot of development thinkers who like to think of development as good change, that it's a process, just like you alluded to. It's a process. It's sort of, there are these things that we know contribute to betterment of humanity, and some communities have them, and some people in those communities have them, and some don't. And so we want to see that get better. So it's just good change, that it's getting better, right? So what I like to do now is a meta-human feat, right? I like to cover about 500 years of history in about 6 minutes. So I'm going to do my best, and I'm just going to give my disclaimer that in doing so, I get to pick what parts of history that I talk about and what parts of history I don't talk about. All right, so that's my disclaimer. And sort of like the conquerors get to write the textbook, I'm the lecturer, I get to pick the history events. But these, just so you know, these are generally, when people write about development history and sort of how the world got to be unequal, these are kind of big ideas that reappear and reappear. So what I'm saying shouldn't be too controversial, but if you disagree with something that I'm saying, please let me know. But these are generally well-established ideas and events throughout history that kind of shape the way that we are as far as inequity. So we like to start with Age of Discovery, which was really the 15th and 17th centuries, right? This was your great explorers, the Pizarros, the Cortezes, to some extent the Columbuses of the world, right? Exploring, seeking out new life, new civilizations, going boldly where nobody has gone before, right? And me, I'm a big Trekkie, if you couldn't tell. So I love Star Trek because it paints this beautiful picture of exploration. And I always wanted to imagine Pizarro and Cortez and Magellan and all these great guys going around and just looking to meet new people and just introduce themselves and exchange, pleasantries and have a coffee together and talk about and learn about each other's cultures. But no, really, we know that during this time that wasn't really the motivating factor for colonization. These were largely corporate ventures that were sent out to go and look for new raw materials and new resources to feed the increasingly industrializing Europe. Right? So you had Europe, which was going through a profound industrial revolution, hungry for raw materials, hungry for labor, super crowded, couldn't mine anymore, couldn't farm anymore, needed more raw materials, more stuff. So off they go to the Americas and parts of Africa, mostly Spanish, British, Portuguese empires, and you have these colonies set up throughout the 17th and 18th century, all over Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Americas, mostly public-private, right? You've heard of the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch South Africa Company. These were all companies that were based in European countries that were financing these trips so that they could go and they really wanted to find wealth. They wanted to find more materials to be able to bring back to Europe to sell and to invest in the capital-hungry European markets. And it was really based on the extraction of resources. It was not really, as a Trekkie would look for it, it wasn't just for exploration purposes. It was for extraction. It was looking for minerals, and they were looking for labor. And many, many populations were uprooted and moved around by the Europeans as they came and they colonized. We, of course, had our own colonies set up here in the United States back in the 1600s. And then, as time goes on and the generations grow up in these countries, they sort of say, why am I sending so many resources to this country I don't know? Why are we even connected to them? What's the benefit? We could do better without them. And so you saw this sort of wave of revolution throughout the Americas, throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s. We had our own revolution here, right, in 1776. And if you look at Latin American history, you'll find that most Latin American countries achieved independence from either Spain or Portugal by about 1840 or 1850. So by the mid-half of 1800s, really, most every country in the Americas was independent. And that impacted the empires, right? That impacted the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese. And so what did? They said, well, these Americans, these people in Latin America and North America and Central America, they're too complicated. They've got their own guns now. They've got their own governments. We really can't suppress them anymore. So we're going to go somewhere else. And they went to Africa. So you saw really through the 1800s and to some extent the early part of the 1900s what was called the scramble for Africa. So these European powers started to set up colonies all over sub-Saharan Africa. And this is a funny little picture, but I mean, the Germans set up colonies in Namibia. There was German East Africa. The Belgians were in East Africa and parts of West Africa. The French were all over West Africa. The British kind of hit Southern Africa and to some extent parts of East Africa. The Spanish and Portuguese and the Italians were colonizing North Africa. And again, these were largely ventures that were centered on extraction, both of natural resources and of labor. Anybody know who this guy is? Who said that? Cecil Rhodes! People usually are like, what is it, Hitler? I don't know, he got the little mustache. No, it's not. That's Cecil Rhodes. And who's Cecil Rhodes?
He was a big industrialist in Southern Africa, I guess, in the Southern Territory, so what we consider South Africa and Botswana, and I think he was a diamond miner.
So you've heard of like the Rhodes Scholarship, right?
Were they Zales?
Huh?
Were they what became Zales?
That I don't know.
That might be too far.
That might be that's ahead of me.
Like Rhodesia was named after.
So
Cecil
Rhodesia. Yeah, Rhodesia was named after Cecil Rhodes. But this guy, more than that, and I completely agree with you, but one other interesting factoid about Cecil Rhodes was that he was in fact he believed in the civilization of African people, right? Almost sort of motivated by a religious zeal about he would go to these countries and say, look at these people. They're poor. They're living in the bush. They're eating animals. They're hunting in loincloths. They're not properly clothed. They don't have a god. They just need civilization. They need us. And so he was probably the biggest colonial fan, right? He would have been the fangirl of colonialism. He set up sort of his enterprises all over Southern Africa. But his dream, you see where his feet are. He has his 1 foot in Cape Town and 1 foot in Cairo. His dream was to build a cable for communications, but also a railway all the way from Cape Town to Cairo. And it wasn't so that the people, the Africans living down there could take a holiday up to the Kenyan coast whenever they wanted. Again, it was to facilitate extraction, right? It was to facilitate movement of people and movement of resources. Any of this sound controversial? Okay, this is pretty well established, right? This is not painting them as necessarily. He thought he was really doing them a favor, right?
I guess the only thing I would say to add to that, which is Cecil Rhodes definitely believed all that, but there is a well-documented history of trade within Africa, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and all sorts of really advanced civilizations in that area. So while he believed that, and a lot of Europeans believe that, the to some degree those paradigms are still perpetuated by the way we teach history. Not at all true. There are all sorts of advanced civilizations and a long history of trade with Europe and the Middle East. So he just believed what he wanted to believe.
That's quite true, and I appreciate you bringing that up. So I want to take a minute, and I'm gonna ask you to do something uncomfortable, which is to be a colonial power. All right, you are a European colonial power. All right, so kind of get into that mindset. You've got a job to do. All right, you've got these colonies to manage, and you need to keep them productive. Okay, so as you can imagine, and I think as was very eloquently described, there was a lot of conflict during colonial period. Right, you had established civilizations that had their own infrastructure, their own societies, really coming into conflict with European colonizers who just happened to have more guns and they happened to have more diseases, right? So they could really, with the combination of those things, could actually could decimate populations more effectively. So this was a time of very intense social and economic upheaval. You can imagine that if there's conflict, sometimes when people want others to leave, they burn down their homes, they burn down bush, and that has a lot of effects on the ecosystem, right? So there was warfare, there was social disruption, and so there was back in the mid 1800s there was an outbreak of African sleeping sickness. And does anybody know what that little guy is? Little tsetse fly with little bug eyes and stuff. Looks all cute and stuff, but he's dangerous. All right, so African sleeping sickness, and so it's estimated that over this time, about over this 10-year period, up to 500,000 people could have perished as a result of sleeping sickness. So as there's all this social upheaval and there's movement of populations and not necessarily the same attention given to land, the forests grew. It fostered wildlife reservoirs for tsetse flies. As you start to urbanize and as you start to clear forests, it condenses the potential environment for them. And so if you have one tsetse fly or two, that's not a problem. But when they breed and you have millions in one small place, well, then that's a problem, right? So I want you to think about the telegrams you're getting from sort of the home base, from your bases in these countries, and I want you to think about what you would do as a colonial power to try to control this. How would you try to control this problem? And remember that, in some way you care about the people there, right? It's not that they were heartless, but they're not necessarily the same as your citizens, right? So what are some of the things, and you're clearly concerned about all these diseases affecting your people as well, right? So what are some things that you can do to try to control this problem?
Yeah, quick question then. How well are we aware of what's causing the sleeping sickness? Did people know it was because of the tsetse fly, because it was being isolated to these regions?
They suspect that it was so this was in the very early stages of us understanding vectors, right? And really, vector-borne disease really didn't come about to the early 1900s. This was sort of, you saw these things, and when you saw these things, you knew people were getting sick. And so the associations were there, but there wasn't the same level of attention. John Snow he did all of his big studies in the mid-1800s, so it was only just then that we were mapping outbreaks and things like that. So it's a good question. Yes, there was a
plague came out. They had no idea what was causing it. They were killing cats and dogs.
That's right.
The things that were supposed to kill rats, which was perpetrators.
So we're going to say that they suspect, that they just know that they need to take care of, well, let's even say that they didn't know. They just know there's clusters of people getting sick. So what can you do to control an outbreak? Good. Separate the sick from the not sick. You are going to be... You are the French. The French. You isolated the sick. Good. Good job. What else? What else can we do?
Obviously, give me forces.
Deforestation. Okay. So you want to burn the bush? That's fine. Go ahead. Bush burning. You're the British. What else? What else? What else can you do? What's that? You could leave, but let's say you didn't want to leave. What could you do? Make the other people leave? So resettle people? That's fun. Okay, so you kind of both did that. You're going to be the British as well, and you guys control the movement of people. You guys, who are left? Okay, you did a lot of stuff.
Walk us through you guys.
Oh yeah, I think you guys are the Belgians, right? Yeah, Belgians. And you guys are the Portuguese. You did kind of a combination of a bunch of them. You did environmental stuff, and you found innovative ways to take care of the vectors. So take a couple minutes, read this, all right? And what I want you to do now is I want you to put on your colonized hats. Now you're the people who this is being done to. And so what I want you to do is, as objectively as you can, sort of say what worked and what didn't work. And how did you feel about it? When this stuff was being done, how did it make you feel? And what do you think was wrong with what was done to you?
So, do you think about Mars as a strategy that the British used was resettle cold villages out of TC flood zones, these massive grids became at times. It was made sense to see as outbreaks and sections working waves now entire villages.
Oh, sure, yeah.
The British used Africa to an environmental area. So we must withdraw from the insects. The source of their flies, they found out natural locations of the indigenous population societies. They were colonized by the British. You were colonized by the British. It's harms and this approach to your community.
Being separated from your yeah.
Especially back then, they are probably good at gravity too. Yeah.
Where do we start with insects? Relocated.
I've been saying overall ecological.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, they want to start over.
Trying to go for my
It also spreads tissue. It just further isolates the TC was, right? I don't really know why they were doing this. I mean, that's the main thing. It destroys habitat and resources.
Come on, guys, let's take one more minute.
The animals eat
So all the laws, government that you've Found these to be so at the perfect time. Yeah, it's a, for sure, yeah. Spiritual.
Yeah. You're right, they probably
All right, guys, let's come together. We're going to change the order around again. Let's go ahead and start with you guys. Oh, yeah, let me just think. You were British, you're Belgian. Who's got a British? You guys got a British? Why don't we start with you guys? So teach us what was done, what worked, what didn't work, how did it make you feel?
Okay. The British moved us to our whole villages out of the GHICC fly zones. So it came in the middle of the disease outbreaks, and decisions were made without our input. Entire villages were forced to pack up and move to an unaffected area. The thought was that we must withdraw from the insects, the source of their infection. So in Uganda, mass relocations of the indigenous population took place. So it really hurt us because we were separated from our loved ones. It was expensive. We really didn't get rid of the disease, had to find new water, food sources, rebuild shelters, new conflicts with like other people in different areas that we moved to. The only benefit was that we were away from the disease and the possibility of starting over and be good students.
Okay, good. I think that's a great point you made about the conflict. You know, I mean, you think, oh, just take these people, we'll just move them over here. You know, no problem. But in fact, you know, tribalism's tribalism, and so sometimes if they're from different ethnic groups, different socio-cultural groups, it can really have a profound effect on conflict. So good. So some things didn't entirely work. You know, they're just, if you don't really know what you're fighting against, you're moving somewhere, they're going to still get it, right? And all you've done is social disruption. Good. Who's the French? Where are my French? French? So teach us what the French did.
So yeah, they quarantined people that were affected, and they gave them Toxol, high doses of it, even though they had better drugs, and they saw that resistance was developing to that medicine. They persisted, and they oftentimes couldn't go back and give further medication to the people they were treating, and it became violent. They would hold people at gunpoint to check their lymph nodes and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So we thought that the benefits at first we thought, oh, we're being treated, this is good. But the harms were that we were isolated and our normal life was disrupted.
Absolutely. And, checking at gunpoint doesn't really feel like home, right? Good. So some security, some human rights issues there. Good. British too. Where's my other British? Yeah.
Do you want us to say what they did?
Yeah, what they did.
Okay, so they tended toward environmental solutions. Their goal was to eradicate the tsetse flies so they would no longer be a vector to transmit the disease. In order to kill the flies, they advocated bush burning, which for habitat was spraying with insecticides. Unfortunately, neither of these strategies were effective. We mostly found harms of this approach, and one being that insecticide itself is pretty dangerous. Or whatever version of insecticide they were using back then probably wasn't nearly as good either. So, it's toxic to the ecosystem around. It can contaminate the water, eliminating a clean water source. Other animals or whatever in the bush could be affected by it, which is a food source to the indigenous people. Bush burning, kind of same thing. You're destroying habitat. You're taking away shelter, a source of food, and messing with the ecological infrastructure. And we also thought that maybe there could be some kind of emotional and spiritual connection to these specific regions that the indigenous people may have had that weren't just taken into account. They're probably just want to have burning. So
I think that is excellent. Those are excellent points. I mean, the connection to land, many cultures, is very, very deep. And so when you start burning it, that can really kind of sour the taste, right? Good. Belgians.
Yeah, so there's just strict police enforcement measures. Basically, any kind of movement was halted any kind of the sick were kind of placed in camps, and where the camps were staffed by Catholic nuns, and basically just separated families, and the sick were left to the care of the Catholic nuns. I don't know how well the treatment was. Family separated.
Yeah. Good. How'd it make you feel?
Yeah.
Not great.
So yeah.
So how, you guys both mentioned the diagnosis, right? How are they making the diagnosis of
Checking the lymphs.
palpating lymph nodes? Any other diseases that can cause enlarged lymph nodes? Not exactly a specific physical exam finding, right? Not exactly the most specific. Probably half you guys have engorged lymph nodes right now, right? Maybe not. I hope not. It is flu season, so get your flu shot. Yeah. So some issues there. I think those are well stated. Separating people. Quarantine has its issues, right? It's one of those archaic things. Been around forever. We've known that if you have sick people and they cluster, then separate those sick people from the not sick, right? But if you're throwing people, separating families and then throwing non-sick people with sick people, you can cause a lot of problems. We're always joking, half joking, but mostly joking. Let's say 85 to 90% joking that, we built a level 4 biosafety facility on the island so that, if someone dropped a bottle of Ebola, you could just sort of close the causeway and, let it sort itself out, right? We always joke about that, and I'm going to say 98% joking because it's extremely safe. You actually, if there's ever a hurricane here, that's exactly where you want to be. It's basically like a bunker. So anyway, I digress. Portuguese, what'd you guys do? Did it work? Yeah. Wildly successful. Why was it successful?
What is this approach? They were having convicts work.
So they did 4 different things, right? They cleared bush. They put these convicts out there in these black outfits to attract tsetse flies, kill them. They injected everybody with atoxyl, which was the only known medication to have effectiveness. And they isolated the sick. So they did kind of a multi-pronged approach. So why did it work there and not anywhere else?
Because they went to the source of the disease.
Uh-huh.
They stopped it from getting worse with the toxin. They also and then also kind of sending as fast as to send convicts out so that more people wouldn't get sick. And then isolating them so that way it doesn't, I don't know what to do to stop that from spreading.
Good. So it's all those things in combination. Plus, it was an island. It's the island of Principe, which is a Portuguese colony off the west coast of Africa. Right? So it was Principe, which was an island. So yeah, it's going to work because where else is it going to come from, right? Whereas Africa's pretty contiguous. At last I checked, so you can do what you can, but if they're gonna find another area to populate and then come to respread and repopulate. So I worked on an island. So how do we feel? So conflicts, the convicts thing always is interesting to me, right? How do you guys feel about the convicts being used? Think that I'm not talking about it's TDCJ guys, right? I'm not talking about the TDCJ guys who have gone through a process, right? A system of laws, right? What do you think it took to be a convict in mid-1800s colonial Portugal?
Not pit taxes.
Yeah.
Looking at a white person the wrong way. I mean, who knows, right? So So I think we have to be careful because the use of convicts and that they got their comeuppance, they really, maybe they did some bad things, who knows? But you could have had a bunch of people who just were in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? And then now they're all black, covered in tsetse flies, and there it is. So good. So awesome. So why do I make you go through this? Dasha, why did you spend 20 minutes making me talk about an outbreak from almost 200 years ago? Well, it's because of context. It's because you guys are here, and you're not the same as the people who did this to these countries. You're not the same as the people who made the decision to hold people at gunpoint and forcefully inject them with medicine or separate them from their families. You're not those people, right? You are born much later, and you guys are in it for different things, right? Like the British, the Portuguese, the French. I mean, I hope I've harped on it enough, but this was exploitation, this was extraction, this was movement of labor, this was fed really by industrial hunger, right? Anybody fed by a desire to colonize or to subjugate or to civilize? It's okay.
But a lot of those economic paradoxes still persist in places that we would consider lower middle income.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not completely.
No, it's not gone. And we're going to definitely get to that. But you guys are not those people. You guys are motivated. I mean, I read all of these things, and I'm always inspired by them because they're just full of hope and energy and good things. So you guys want to do this because you want to address health disparities. You want to learn about different health systems and perspectives on how to deliver health care, seeing the world and traveling, learning about different cultures. You guys are totally Captain Kirking it here, right? Someone wrote, "I like humans. That's why I'm here. I like humans," right? Hopefully not to eat or to otherwise use, but I like humans, right? Improving world health, challenging yourself, engaging with your profession and understanding how your profession can contribute to improving the world, teaching, understanding what lessons we can learn from other countries to apply to communities here, understanding determinants of health. You're interested in population health. You want to help people. Some of you see yourselves in a career where you're actually going to resource-poor settings and providing care, or at least being in those settings. And that's so different, right? Everybody agrees that's way different, right? You are not those people. But when you go somewhere, you're walking into history. You're walking into a different context. And it's not one that you can necessarily eschew, right? When you go into that setting, you may not be that colonial person, but people who have come before you, who came with great intentions, also did terrible things, right? And you're not going to do terrible things, or you hope you're not going to do terrible things, right? And generally, you won't do terrible things, but you're going to be, in many cases, received that way. And I'm sure, some of you guys have done Peace Corps, some of you guys have done volunteerism, and you've probably felt that way, like, I feel like I'm doing good, but I'm not really sure if anything I'm doing is actually being received, right? Because you're seen through that lens. I remember when the Ebola outbreak was taking place back in 2014. I was listening to the radio, and they had an interview, and it was around the time that the U.S. military was planning or was trying to go and set up Ebola treatment units, ETUs, in Liberia, and there was controversy because the Liberians didn't want the military. And I remember someone called up the radio program and said, well, they're just, if they don't want our help, they just don't, it's just because they just don't know what they need, and they're just being difficult, and we're just trying to help them, but imagine you're in Liberia, and Liberia's history with the United States is terrible. We sent, Liberia was colonized by slaves? Like the slaves that decided to leave, they left and they colonized Liberia, and they were really terrible, right? They were really oppressive to local dark-skinned populations, right? Probably like cousins, right? So they named the guy who sent him was James Madison. The capital is Madisonville, right? So anyway, So there was just a complete ignorance of history and context. Well, the U.S. military showing up in West Africa is not exactly the most welcome thing. And so context is important. And so we have, in global health, in academics, we've done some relatively disingenuous things, right? We've gone at the beginning of I'd say the bad old days of academic global health, students would go and do stuff that they shouldn't have been doing, right? I remember, we'll talk about this, I'm going to tangent a little bit because I think it's relevant. I went to Uganda because we send our students to Uganda, and I was sitting with the hospital superintendent over a cup of tea, and we were just talking about sort of our expectations for students. And I said, we were having a good discussion about what students should and shouldn't do. And I said, I just really think they should do things that are within their scope, within their realm, things that are, they shouldn't be experimenting and practicing on Africans just because they can't do it here. And he said, yeah, it resonates because he said there was a doctor, a missionary doctor, and she brought her husband. He was also Dr. whatever, we'll say Dr. Smith, and he said, she worked here for a while, and he came and said, hey, can I come and scrub in on a C-section? And I said, oh yeah, sure, Dr. Smith, that's fine, yeah, come in. And so he scrubbed in, he opened, they did the C-section, and then they said, okay, can you close? And he said, actually, I don't know how to. I'm a veterinarian, right? And so so Africa, Latin America is littered with those stories, all right? And you are not those people, right? But you're coming into that. You're coming into that hundreds of years of sort of misbehavior, and all you can do is be sensitive to it and try to build relationships and try to get around it. I mean, it's taken me now, the Dominican, I've been going for 6 years, and I'm finally sort of accepted as not being colonial. Academic institutions have come and done research and taken out data, published a lot of papers, left no mark in those countries. People have built their entire careers on global health who have never left a mark aside from taking out data and doing their own research on those populations. And so even though you're not those people and you're not colonial, you're motivated by all the right stuff, you may be perceived. And so it's just something not to deter you, but it's something to be aware of. And so when you're not welcomed with open arms the first time, maybe the second time, you just keep, if it's really in your heart and it's really motivating you, then you just got to be persistent. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So let me just continue with history, because actually development people in international development studies, they really like this. They don't like World War II. I'm not going to say that. But they like starting development history at World War II. Why do you think that is? What happened in World War II? Why would people say that the root of, let's say, poverty, the haves and the have-nots, really was brought to light after World War II? So this is the Nuremberg trials, right? Atrocities exposed, right? Media was able to cover it. Photos circulated so people could see atrocities and they could see what terrible things had happened during World War II. 12 million killed in concentration camps, half of them Jews. Just terrible things happened in World War II, and it sort of was one of those like defining moments in world history, right? Europe was decimated. The only real world power that was left at that time was the United States. So what do we do? Interesting things happened as a result of this amalgam of circumstances. We started to see, instead of the nation state being the driver of everything, this is Europe versus France, this is Germany versus US, nation statehood started to be, you couldn't have nation statehood because in Europe there were no nation states. It just all crumbled, all disaster. Ever heard of the Marshall Plan? Yeah, the Marshall Plan was this really ambitious plan that was ratified by U.S. Congress and said, we are going to help bankroll the reconstruction of Europe, right? And we're going to bankroll, we're going to fund it. You started to see towards the end of World War II the Allied powers coming together and saying, what are we going to do after the war? How are we going to rebuild this? This is going to take huge amounts of capital, huge amounts of money, and lots of healing, obviously, but huge amounts of capital. And so we needed a system to manage that. And so they came up with the Bretton Woods institutions, which are now the World Bank and the IMF, but the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, was really what came out of that conference. And that was in 1944, towards the end of the war. And in this sort of spirit of kind of the world needs to come together to acknowledge these atrocities and to acknowledge how do we prevent these things, the UN was formed in 1945. And this was really, because it wasn't all about economics and about finances, it was about how do we preserve rights? How do we ensure peace? I mean, the UN was really founded so that all of member states, all countries could have a voice and could express in a forum their concerns about peace, violence, and security, right? The World Health Organization, shortly after that formed, 1948, this was about not just about diseases that move between populations, though that was really a really important part of WHO's work, but also to share policies, to share best practices, to start sharing information between countries so that they can all achieve a better standard of health. And then what you saw after World War II was this profound effervescence of colonialism, right? So these war-torn European countries couldn't sustain African colonies. Just the transport costs were too much. And they said, you know what? Can't do it. Got to focus. The Marshall Plan was helping to reconstruct Europe. They said, let's just end colonialism. We're not going to be in these countries anymore, right? And so rapid. I mean, these are colonies that took hundreds, sometimes hundreds of years. Generations had been born under colonialism, right? In India, in other parts of East Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa. And you saw this rapid de-escalation of colonialism, right? And so countries that really didn't have borders because they were sort of colonial demarcations, the borders were drawn very quickly, right? Mostly by Europeans sitting in offices, right? Sometimes not even in those countries, sometimes in Geneva or elsewhere, in London, in Paris. And they said, okay, this one's yours, this is Uganda, this is Kenya, this one is Central African Republic, this one, and here's the borders, here's your national anthem, here's your flag, here's your soccer team, go. Right? I mean, this is literally, it sounds flippant to say, but it's really what happened. And during that time, I mean, what do you think happened? I mean, you mentioned before, could these nations that all of a sudden had an installed system of governance, I mean, were they really going to be self-sufficient and to all of a sudden develop their own economies to sustain development? No, of course. This was sort of how the whole development enterprise came about. Was, well, now we need to go support the former colonies. Oh, these poor countries, they need to do for themselves. They can't do without us, so we need to now help them, right? And so that's really what happened and this is one slide for 60 years of a development enterprise. So apologies for that. But this really was where the study and the technocratic exercise of development grew, right? Was post-World War II, defervescence of colonialism. And you saw a lot of different strategies come out of think tanks and about big thinkers, mostly kind of from the West, from US, from Europe, large financial institutions which were mostly run by the former Allied powers. Top-down versus bottom-up strategies. We debated whether it was better to have a government lead the growth or better to go directly to the people and let them lead the growth. We started to study it, become very scientific about it. From all of the failures of state-led growth came this movement of community participation. You can't really develop a state without the participation of the community. Most of the funding, and Dr. Enderle is going to get into this at the next session, but most of it was funding from resource-rich countries, targeted interventions in resource-poor ones. There were many, many, many issues with that, which you'll unpack next time. Cold War politics got in the way, right? Because in some countries they could receive aid from the West, they could receive aid from the East, and if they said the right things to the right people, they could get lots more and they could buy more BMWs, right? So it fed sort of systems of corruption. Cold War politics got in the way, and then ultimately in 2008, the financial crisis, everybody said, well, Africa should be able to take care of itself now. It's been 50 years. and nobody has any money, and everybody invested in houses that they shouldn't have invested in. So the whole economy's gone belly up. So let's go ahead and reduce the amount of aid that we're giving in international aid. So that's where we are now, right? So I want to decide. Any questions about that? Comments? Thoughts?
Sorry, I don't want to keep jumping in.
You jump in.
But I think, the de-escalation of colonialism was actually quite fraught, and there were very long, with the end of World War II, a lot of Africans fought in World War II on the side of the Allies, and when they came back to their constituent countries, they had been told and talked a lot about self-determination in government. That was a huge concept, and they, collectively came together and said, how are we going to fight for the independence and the foundation of, independence of these European countries when we ourselves are not free? And I think a lot of that stuff wasn't just the de-escalation because Europeans couldn't afford to be colonists anymore, but because there were huge pushes on the parts of a lot of these countries to develop their own forms of government. And in a lot of cases, the Europeans were more than happy to let go of the colonies because they cost a lot of money, but also did it in the most undermining possible way, where they said, oh, you want to be free? Sure, tomorrow. And up and left people with no institutions, there's no transfer of power, complete vacuums. And then they said, oh, you want help? Well, we can send you a company. And so then neo-colonialism comes into I understand we don't have enough time for you, but I do think it's interesting that self-determination is a huge concept. There are huge pushes within those countries to become independent.
Yeah, and absolutely. And some succeeded and some did not, right?
Some than others, certainly.
And you saw sort of the really tribal, sort of the elites that had been
hundreds of years of Europeans messing with social hierarchy, and it really had its effect. Yeah, and then as to your point about the Cold War politics, that had a huge effect because a lot of those countries were a lot more socialist leaning, we would say, than we were, and so a lot of times the Americans and other powers would come in and depose governments that happened in Congo or Zaire and put in dictators that were favorable to our needs or wants or desires. And so, again, just so much ugly history in past colonialism.
And this was sort of the legacy of the CIA, right? I mean, the CIA really
that
was.
comes up to today that is going on.
So again, that's post-colonial history.
Yeah.
It's tough,
yeah,
right? So now you want to be there, right? You want to figure out, what do I do, right? And it's not, again, none of this is to say that you can't do something effective, but it's just knowing that stuff happened.
Yeah, and that you'll be perceived through those eyes. I have lived abroad, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and people ask me many times, if I was in the CIA, if I was part of the CIA, because that's the history. Why are you here? What do you want from us? And you just have to go in every day and be a real genuine person who's there to do what you're actually there to do, and don't abuse people's trust, because it has been very abused. That is real.
I completely agree. I want to do metrics. I think we can do it in 10 minutes.
Sorry.
No, you're so good. I'm trying to think. I want to do metrics. I think it's really important, but I also think that it's getting late. I always run out of time with metrics. Okay, we're gonna put metrics because I think there's fun stuff. You see the fun stuff, right? There's fun stuff happening here, right? Everybody's eyeing this fun stuff, and I think it'd be good to have time for fun stuff. So, we're gonna post some of these. I have information on metrics. So this is actually some of the boring nitty-gritty, but it's really important because we can't teach you about international aid if you don't understand how development is measured. So we're going to post stuff on Blackboard for you to look at. We have several different metrics that are being used: gross domestic product, gross national income, gross national product, the Human Development Index, and the Big Mac Index, the other BMI I like to say. We'll post information about that just so you can read up on it. So when we come to the next session, you'll know what those ideas, those terms are. But if I will talk about GDP because I think that's probably the most common one, Who's heard of GDP? All right, so what is it? Yes, but what is it? So what's it measure?
Like income.
Like your consumption, your investments. That's like one measure of it, right? Like summing up essentially what your country is like consuming and spending and investing.
So consumption, investment.
Oh, I thought it had something to do with the income, like per person.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's 4 big components to GDP, and you've got 2 of them. Consumption, investment. What else contributes money to the economy?
Exports.
Good. So exports or imports? Or both?
Both.
How about the balance of those? How about net exports, right? So exports, the value of exports minus the value of imports, right? If you're exporting raw materials and you're importing television sets, is that going to be a positive or negative? Negative, right? It's going to subtract from your economy, right? Because you're exporting the cheap stuff and you're importing the expensive stuff. And if you're a net exporter of televisions and a net importer of the raw materials, then it's going to contribute to the economy, right? There's one more big thing that contributes to the economy. More in other countries, right? It's government, right? So government. So consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports, right? So you can consume an apple or you can consume a haircut. So it's value of goods and services within the country, right? And, then there's investment. So you don't spend every dollar that you make. You put some in the bank. And unlike my parents-in-law, like you don't just put that money. They don't put it on the cushions, right? What do? They invest it. They give it to people. They give it to people who want to start a small business or people who want to buy a house, who want to invest in education, right? That money, you put it in there, it's not going in, it's not all in the vault, right? They have to have some cash available. But really it goes into the nebulous world of investment, right? Where none of these things actually are real. So so you can invest in things. So you consume, invest, government expenditures, and then net exports. So that's GDP. And generally what we do in development discourse, we just divide that by the population. So it's called GDP per capita. Do you like that? What bothers you about that? Does it sit well?
Just equally distributed across the person.
Yeah, so it doesn't account for inequality, right? What else?
I think kind of along that, it kind of like establishes like which areas are not necessarily like low income versus
Okay, good. So it is good. That's a positive actually, is that you can measure it, right? And you can compare it between countries. We like comparing countries using some kind of number. So that's one. What else? Anybody ever been to a, let's call it like a low resource or low middle income country? Okay, how many of you guys have taken a taxi? Okay, did you get a receipt? No? How about the bus? Could you get a receipt? No. So is that reportable income, you think? You consumed it, but is it measured? Shadow economies, right? So it doesn't cover huge shadow economies. Shoe shine. There are countries where half of the economy is shadow economy, right? So you're not measuring it. And drug trade and things like that doesn't capture it. GDP per capita, those things generally don't want to be measured in your GDP per capita. So income distribution is not accounted for. And is that development? Not really, right? It's just about money. It's just this part. Now, the reason we keep teaching about it and learning about it is because as hard as we try to quit GDP per capita and find something better, we just can't find anything better for a lot of reasons. Number one, it correlates with all the other stuff. So healthier is wealthier, right? I mean, all those doctrines and treatises, there are other ways to measure development, education metrics, health metrics, but at the end of the day, income actually is relatively independent indicator. So I think we have to take all those things with a grain of salt. So here's what we're going to do. That's my pitch on GDP per capita. We'll put more information up there. One person from each group. We're gonna finish with this, and they answer the question you have to answer with a craft project. And you have a little piece of cardboard on there. Some of you may have written on it. It's fine. Just flip it over. We have glue. We have tape. We have scissors. We have little animals and soldiers and puffs and balls and pipe cleaners and all kinds of fun stuff. So thinking about Fernando, thinking about development, what does it take to achieve someone's full potential? Keeping in mind all that historical context, keeping in mind how you're perceived, all those things we've talked about today. Go ahead and pick one, think about it, think about what you may want to do, and then send someone up here. You can even just take a whole bunch of stuff. Be creative, and then take about 10 minutes to put it together, and then we're going to ask everybody to teach us what you guys did. Okay?
No, me neither. What do you want?
See what the whole thing went over my head, but I can do that.
What? Fun colors?
Yeah. You're going to have to help us teach the class.
It was an awesome presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought you did a really
You're going to have to help us. You're going to have to join the site. But we usually have student facilitators too.
I would love to help if you guys are looking
Yeah,
for it.
next year
I'm always
we
down
will.
to
Anybody who's finished the course can come as a teacher.
Hell yeah, I would be happy to. Colonial Latin history is like my jam.
Jam, man. Yeah, well, if you live in Mali, then it has to be.
Yeah, and Cameroon.
I did so much honey questions that
And
went
I
bad.
was an African history major.
Yeah.
Day we did it.
You're going to love next session. Then. Talk about,
All about money.
we talk about.
I know
That's
that's
important, that really the positive and negative. That's just what opened my eyes, when I came to the perception of this and all that, how what you perceive to be such a magnanimous gesture
so loaded.
is, and I tell those stories. Well, grab some animals,
Actually, that's like
you
exactly.
leave and then nobody comes back to the morning.
Yeah. What's in it for me? Where's my place? Oh, you're not paying, not interested. Well, and what you said about like being perceived through the colonialist guys, 100% every time. Like you'll never be perceived any way other than like everybody who came before you, and a lot of others came before us.
I even heard a story. A guy that I work with, he's got friends that were stranded on the and couldn't get back. They were trying to find food and water.
Could be like
They stand in line for hours, and they were not accepted. They were harassed, they were bullied, they were afraid for their safety because they were like, "What are you doing here?" They were perceived as infectious in the U.S. What's going on? Probably may or may not be true, but they say for their vacation.
Oh, we need glue.
Their condo on the first floor because of weather conditions is damaged. So they moved it to the second floor condo room, and the manager $500 a day. I don't even know if we'll share food with them.
Soccer ball.
I guess we can just start like
This way. A guy worked there. And they couldn't get off, and they had some guy here who was doing everything he could. They had a generator just charge yourself home. And then that ran out. And then there was this cruise ship, and we were all thinking, oh, the cruise ship is going to come and take people off. They're going to get on that. They said, no, I'm going to stab myself with it.
Yeah, exactly. Give myself a medical condition.
I guess he rescued him. He had a private plane and was going back and forth, and they found receipts on that because they told him to be October 3rd, and they already knew before the hurricane. But they did get him on about the like this last week. They found the receipts.
They don't care.
It's a trap.
The whole thing is Canadian response. And watching our president there in Puerto Rico is really
Oh, yeah.
It's sad, man.
So that would be your vacation. Right?
It would be. I mean, desperation just doesn't breed compassion. Yeah, that's when you realize how foreign you really are.
Yeah,
My 80-year-old uncle is in Thailand. He emails me a couple of times a week, and he always tells a story about anytime he goes over there, depends on who's in it, and all his presidential fans. He always interacts with them. She wrote in this, you know, with George W. Did you vote for that ignorant person? So they have all of these.
And we'd all be willing to take 10 George Bushes right now.
Fairly accurate. That's right. That's what I said.
No, still, I would.
Makes it And I never thought I would have said that. Almost. So yeah, it's different when you're the white skinned person amongst all of the others. Of course, they don't do that to my aunt because she's so thankful. But for him, he's exactly they all want to know all this stuff.
Yeah.
Their ideas.
What do they got? We got these puzzles. That's a good idea.
Fruit.
Yeah, not all. I like it.
I was thinking for the water. I don't know.
Or the glitter. Is there blue glitter here?
Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. Okay. That would look cool. You can make waves like this and put blue underneath it and then
Yeah, glitter.
glitter it.
Sure.
And then what were the other things? Shelter. Oh.
Here, we could use this coral reef. That's not shelter for humans, but that's like shelter for animals. Okay. I like this rhino.
We have these puzzles for food and glitter and for water.
Yeah, one more. Yeah, totally. And there you go. You're not big, but yeah.
No, there's a strategy.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Like it's not
I think maybe you can make a flag for governments out of these buttons. I wonder what colors would it's like Nigeria here, green, white, green. Yeah, this could be a country. Or we need to do that. I don't think we need flags. Yeah, this right here is a flag. Orange, white, and green, that's India. And Italy, actually.
maybe from like
They're all very different. Yeah. Very interesting, but here's the
this is representing It's like random. Oh yeah,
Thailand. What the British call it.
It's that
All three seasons. And then they keep on something. It's a sporting movie.
All right, guys, let's take one more minute.
It's contemporary.
Extremely
We're
good.
going for minimalist and contemporary. I know. We can put the you don't want them running around with us. Oh, yeah, you think it's bad? I don't think it's good to have them like whatever this is running around. You're like the kid's playing, yeah. Fernando's trying to play.
When you have a little bit of water in there.
Water, yeah.
It's not clean water source. Slightly.
So are we gonna have time to just run water or are they go to be? What is
Whatever you thought to start with.
You don't need to do
Alright, so you guys like animals running near you?
Our unused items.
All right.
Yes.
All right, guys. Let's come together. I see some excellent, very innovative, amazing crafts. All right, guys, let's get started. I see a group here that looks ready to present. Okay.
Can't really lift it up.
Oh, we can't lift it? Okay, let's see.
I'll stand up, we can see it.
Oh.
This is why we can't lift it.
I see. Oh, the guys all fall down.
No, you didn't really see everything down.
That's all right. Well, let you walk us through it.
So basically, what is development answer is we wanted to show like the process of development. So you're starting off with like uninhabited land, animals, you got that tree, and then the water, your food and resources essentially, and then you gotta have people to inhabit the land, also make use of the land and settle it. So that's why we have our people there. I guess they're hunting. And then we have this ribbon of trucks, kind of representing that transportation of the resources, also kind of like the industrialization that we have come to now. And like, yeah, so that kind of progression. We had created a $sign out of buttons, so that represents the economy that's established, and then also kind of like the currency. And then this triangle represents our house, the shelter. And then the sphere represents like how it's a global development. It's not just how it happens, development everywhere. So.
Love it. It looks like it's all interconnected there.
Yeah.
That's great. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You want to come and review this beautiful piece of art? You're welcome to. Can we pick? You guys want to come look at the beautiful piece of art? It looks very nice. I need to get one of these. I need to get that app where you just put your phone on it and it live streams. I need to Periscope it or something. Yeah. Or Facebook Live it. Yeah. Okay. Guys, what do you think? Can we lift it? Are we able to lift it at all? Okay.
Or we can bring it. Can everybody see it from the back table?
I don't know. Animals look like they may experience some earthquakes.
Yeah.
All right. Walk us through it.
Well, Fernando has a beautiful home that is very contemporary, kind of minimalist. We've got clean water, and he's got plenty of protein. I actually got him some fish, and clearly the animals are not dangerous anymore. And we have a representation of, he's now in a place where he can play soccer with his friends. He's got safety and friends and community.
That's awesome. I love it. I want to live there. I want to live in that minimalist house. Awesome. What about you guys? Already lift?
I don't think this glitter's gonna.
That's okay. Glitter's closed.
That'll work.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you want me to hold it up here, or you can let me hold it up in the front. Okay.
Yeah, we made like a pyramid that's kind of symbolic of all the needs that we talked about. So at the bottom is like food, water, and shelter. So like the waves represent water, the orange is food, and then the coral reef is shelter. And then the one above is government stability. So we have two flags, one of Italy and Nigeria, just made out of buttons to show government stability. And then the next one, we were trying to be creative and say education. There was only one fish, but we wanted several fish together to make a school of fish.
Oh, I like it.
And then the Band-Aid is healthcare. And then, what is that? Yeah, the emotional support for the heart, and then we have kind of money at the top that brings the whole thing together.
Look at that. That is very nice. It's very nice. Get in line. Did you guys ever read Mr. Fish goes to school? Mr. Fish goes to school? Mr. Fish goes to school, and he goes to school with a lot of different animals. Right on. Awesome. All right, guys. What we got here? Can I lift this? Is it liftable? It's tenuous. Don't fall off, monkeys. Okay. All right, walk us through it. Anybody see fish?
Feathers also represent like education and like we had a book of laws. The little pond turned the animals to represent like environment, like bush and forestation. The spider is actually supposed to represent government and like protection.
And then you brought it into web. You pay your taxes.
And then the little pom-poms are supposed to represent communities with like different colors and shapes and fibers.
Any questions about this? Monkey and hippo, just kind of drinking water in the good environment there. All right, here we go. I can pick it up. Okay, sorry, I knocked it over. Okay, everything is firmly taped in. There are 9 layers of tape on this. All right, what do we have?
Okay, so this is their representation. So as you can see, we tried to create a little bit of a circle here, and each being has its own symbolism. So there's the fiber one groundwork, represents nutrition, food, sun represents security and safety. Our alligator here is environment, and our bull here is for school certification. And a little bit is represent different things, education. So we have love here, we have security, some support. And all that is good.
501, he's just nutrition.
Exactly.
Awesome. Love it. Did I miss anybody? No? You guys are great craftspeople. So we do this because not only is it fun, but it also kind of, in education, they're like, it always works if you go at it in different ways. And so you may not remember all the garbage that I've been saying at you in words, but you'll remember the pom-poms, and you'll remember the dollar sign at the top of the pyramid, and you'll remember the house. So this is kind of like feeding into that's kind of the wrap up here. We like this guy. Anybody know who this guy is? Oh, I already know. It doesn't say. Anybody know who he is? This is Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. Okay, Amartya Sen's a Nobel laureate economist, Indian guy, and his whole treatise, the thing that got him the Nobel Prize, was that he studied the Bengali famine in the 1940s. And what he elaborated was, in fact, that not only was there enough food, but the famine was really not necessary. And it was there because of all of the elite and social structures that persisted in that society that separated people from resources, and that people could not participate because of the famine. They could not achieve their full potential. And what he said is he came up with this whole idea of development as freedom. And development is really the freedom, and it's not freedom like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, not just that. It's freedom from illness, freedom to be educated, freedom to participate in the economy, freedom to participate in the system of governance. And where he comes from is that, basically his idea is that the usefulness of wealth is not actually the wealth, it's what it allows you to do, it's how it allows you to be free. And so it was a big groundbreaking, and it sounds sort of like, well, duh, but it's not. This was quite groundbreaking. People were really convinced that it was about economic development. It was about getting money into people's hands, and just if they had that dollar bill, if they got from $1 a day to $5 a day, they would be able to thrive. He says it's not about the money, it's not just about its distribution, it's about what they can do with it. So he said development is freedom, and it kind of led into this human capability approach, that freedom gives you the capability to be healthy, the capability to be educated, and the capability to participate in the economy. So I think you guys have illustrated what Fernando needs to be healthy. He needs all of these things. He needs all the things that you listed up here on the board and all of the stuff that you've developed, that you've discussed here today. So global health really is this offshoot of international development. I think hopefully after this you have a better understanding of kind of how we got here and what we're going to do about it and how you're going to engage in that world. So what I want you to do is for next month, take a look at the literature, take a look at the news. It doesn't have to be an exhaustive PubMed search or anything like that. We want you to find some sort of real world situation or article that pertains to international aid in your profession. Right? So this is kind of leading up into next session for international aid and humanitarian assistance. So think about it from the perspective of your profession and bring it to class and be ready to, I'm not going to have everybody present it, but especially if you have something really keen or interesting, we want to hear about it. And think about why development matters to people who want to practice global health in your profession. Why should we learn about all this stuff? And why is it important to your profession? And that's it. See you next month. Thank you. Yeah, you just put those guys in a pile over here. We'll clean up all the. You can leave your art projects. We'll come around and we'll remove all of the reusables. Hey. Oh yeah, leave your name thing as well.
Buttons. Is there a button bag?
Yep, button's right here.
Oh, they are right in front of me.
Oh, no.
Sticks? Here's some sticks. Yeah, I was like, there was a huge guy in there. Thank you. Bye. See you next week.
Thank you. Take care. Let's see my tarantulas here.
Yeah, like the government.
No.
That was funny.
I thought I saw you walk in.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing great. Just like the students, I always tell them, it'll be great. You'll go in tired and you'll feel energized when you get through. I feel energized.
It's good.
They really were. I I was sitting in the back, I could watch them, and they were participating, you know, for the most part, most all of them. Some are very quiet.
Some groups are less engaged.
I think Group B was pretty interactive.
Were they?
They seemed more talkative, engaged with the activity.
Yeah. That's right, we can leave this, Brad. Brad has there's a method to the madness.
Oh, no, just, you just want to go back in the box. Over there somewhere. I organized it when I'm putting it out, but not when I'm putting it away. It all just gets jumbled up anyway.
Oh no, I'm trying to be really neat. Don't just throw it.
So that's got to go upstairs and back into storage for another year.
God, this is the last session of this topic.
I gotta say, this stuff has gone we've been using this for 4 years now.
Yeah, we may have to update some of the supplies for next year, but
Colonel and I, you know, this was $100 at Michael's. Good.
yeah, man, things are real good.
Ready for this closing next week?
Got everyone squared away. Waiting for a few more things from Tony, but bad.
Tony Money O'Malley?
Yeah. I had a hard time with that last week.
You think?
Tony Adam?
Oh, not bad.
Do you want the cards in here also, or no? The
Yeah,
notes?
yeah, everything
Really?
is put back in that box.
You say so.